Live from Gloucester, this is the Saturday Breakfast Show with Darren Lister, and you are listening live.
Guten Morgen. I am having a German-tastic week this week as I am joined by my guest Lucy Dresnan, and we will be talking all things German in light of the announcement this week that the government wishes to push German teaching and learning in England. Very excited as we chat with Lucy today.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org or join in the conversation by downloading the Podbean app and following Teachers Talk Radio. #TT Radio.
Good morning, everybody. It is a very chilly 5 degrees on this Saturday, the 19th of November, 2022. And I must say, I am rather enjoying it. I've had a fantastic combination this week of German and Christmas. Yes, I am getting ready for the season because I got to spend Thursday with my Year 8 German beginners at Bristol Christmas Market, which was wonderful. It's been quite difficult as an MFL teacher over the past couple of years to give our students the experiences that we kind of want to give them, that we want them to have, because of course trips abroad have been so difficult. We had Brexit announced and we kind of went into a bit of a panic about that, those of us that habitually do international residentials, because we weren't quite sure how Brexit would hit us in terms of being able to take our students abroad for educational trips. And then those of us, of course, that teach in schools with a big international cohort had an extra layer of bureaucracy that started to creep in when we realised that Brexit would also have an impact on our visa holders. And then, of course, no sooner had we started to try and get those things underway, but COVID hit, which put an end to all international trips. And it seems like they are only just beginning to get started again. At my school, we did attempt to do a trip to Paris at Easter time, but unfortunately it fell through just because the red tape ended up being unmanageable and we couldn't do it in the time frame that we had wanted to. And so I think many of us who teach languages have been looking for alternative provision so that we can still give our learners the experiences that they deserve, the cultural experiences particularly that they deserve. Because I am in a minority of linguists, and I understand that I'm in a minority, because I do not believe that you necessarily need to spend an extended amount of time in a country to learn the language. I think that you can learn any language anywhere. Because if it were true that you needed to be in the country in order to learn the language, then classics, which we know is my first love, that would have died out because we cannot physically go to ancient Rome in order to learn Latin. And so I think that for me personally, it's the culture that is more difficult to recreate in the classroom. I can create language experiences. I find it quite difficult to recreate cultural experiences. And that's where the international trips really have value for me. And I have felt a bit guilty over the past couple of years that my learners have gone without those. And so last year, the head of prep languages at my school and I sat down together and we tried to figure out what we could do for our Year 8 beginners in German and Spanish to give them a cultural experience that they wouldn't otherwise have. And luckily, relatively close to me, about 40 minutes away, there is an authentic German Christmas market that runs through November and December. So I took my Year 8s, 21 of them, on Thursday, and we had a wonderful time shopping and trying all sorts of different sausages and just generally soaking up the culture and getting ready for the Christmas season. So I am very much ready for Christmas now, I'm going to be honest. I haven't really celebrated it over the past couple of years. I'm normally the Christmas guy. Christmas is my favourite time of year. But for the past 2 years, I've not really been too bothered about it. I don't even think I decorated last year, if I'm completely honest. But I do kind of feel in the spirit now. And I'm very, very excited to to get started. And I'm very excited to continue my shopping. I have started my shopping. I started my shopping back in August, actually. But now that I'm starting to get all the emails coming through about Black Friday deals, I think I might need to make my bank account cry and start my Christmas shopping in earnest.
This episode of Teachers Talk Radio has been made possible with support from Witherslack Group, the UK's leading provider of SEN education and care. They're here to support you too through an ever-growing offer of free resources, including webinars, podcasts, articles, and events aimed at supporting teaching professionals like you. Visit their website at www.witherslackgroup.co.uk to find out more.
If you're listening to this, then we know we share one thing in common: a passion for the type of outstanding education that every child deserves. That's what makes us the leading provider of specialist education and care. We need people like you to help us achieve even more. With us, you'll be given all the resources and support you need, offered a clear path to career progression, and be rewarded with some of the best salaries and benefits the industry has to offer. We are Witherslack Group. If you'd like to find out more, we'd love to hear from you. Visit www.witherslackgroup.co.uk/careers and be part of our future.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
With the World Cup due to begin, TES magazine reveals why some schools won't be screening games during school time. The competition, held in Qatar, is the subject of much concern from some school leaders, worried about the ethics of showing games held in a country with a poor record when it comes to human rights. England play one game against Iran during school hours, but whilst many school leaders have chosen to show significant games in the past, some are choosing not to do so this time. FIFA's choice to host the tournament in Qatar has been controversial from the outset because of the country's laws on homosexuality and its treatment of migrant workers. Some heads have said that showing the game would be at odds with lessons on diversity and equality. Not all leaders share the same view, and some schools will show the game, but will have what is described as age-appropriate discussions about the ethics of the tournament alongside. Decisions of this nature are always left to individual school leaders, and as debate about the tournament continues, the only real certainty is that this World Cup will be remembered for its controversial hosts, if nothing else. The last week has seen many schools participate in activities to mark Anti-Bullying Week. To further acknowledge the impact bullying can have on young people and their families, the government's Education Hub has published an article laying out what they're doing to help combat bullying in education. This support has largely been in the form of government grants to fund projects and organisations who do important anti-bullying work. This has included further funding for the Diana Award, a recognised anti-bullying programme, the Anti-Bullying Alliance, a new programme to prevent and tackle bullying through quality RSHE education, the Anne Frank Trust to continue the different but the same project, diversity role models, developing intervention materials for schools, and Equaliteach to support multi-academy trusts or local authorities to create change. Full details of all the projects and the funding can be found on the .gov UK website, as well as in the Preventing and Tackling Bullying Guidance. The Scottish Government will launch an online national discussion on Scottish education the week beginning the 21st of November. Children, young people, parents, carers and teachers are being encouraged to take part by registering for events. Those who register will be able to talk directly to the independent facilitators, Professor Alma Harris and Professor Carol Campbell. The discussion was first launched in September, but in order to ensure as full a discussion as possible, the online events have also been launched. So far, the discussion has received 3,500 responses, and feedback will be open until the 5th of December. The Schools and Academies Show 2022 saw the Chair of Ofqual, Ian Buckham, discuss plans for exams and grading for 2023, as well as considering the future of exams, assessment and the use of technology. In his speech, he made it clear that exams and other formal assessments that are like exams give students the fairest chance to show what they know and what they can do. He cited feedback from students, parents and teachers, which he said was overwhelmingly positive, particularly about the return to normal exams in 2022 after the difficulties of the pandemic. Whilst exams in 2023 will see a return to pre-pandemic grading, safeguards will be put in place to ensure no pupil is disadvantaged. This will be the same as those put in place for the 2017 series when pupils sat the reformed GCSE and A-level qualifications for the first time. He went on to speak about the impact of digital tech and described it as when, not if, there would be a greater use of it in high-stakes exams. He did, however, acknowledge that a move to greater digital assessment can only come about through joint working across a range of partners and stakeholders, so as not to experiment with young people's futures. A full transcript of the speech can be found on the DFE website. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to look at smartwatches. For those of you that don't know what a smartwatch is, it's basically a watch that has the ability to connect to your phone, enhancing the experience of the owner's smartphone by delivering notifications and controls via an interface, which shows more discreetly and allows the user to decide whether they need to get their phone out or not. This is a real bonus for teachers, as a lot of schools have no phones policies, making it difficult to be contacted during the day. Some smartwatches also can stand alone without the need for a short-range phone connection, as they've got built-in cellular or Wi-Fi capability, extending the range of connection, allowing the phone to be left at home. Although this can be useful, you need to bear in mind that there are additional costs for this, and answering calls makes you look like you're on an episode of Star Trek talking to your wrist unless you have headphones, and replying to texts can be tricky using the watch interface. That being said, one of the most powerful features of smartwatches is the ability to use contactless payment with them, a real time saver and also peace of mind. A downside of contactless payment using smart devices is some payment machines, in particular parking meters, only accept cards. This needs to be kept in mind when travelling around. So, what is the best? Well, that depends on the phone you currently have. It isn't really about the best, it's about compatibility. If you want an Apple Watch, you need to have an Apple phone. Android allows more options and also can be considerably cheaper. You need to ask yourself a few questions to decide what's best for you. Here are the questions I'd ask when considering a smartwatch. What do I want it for? If it's to see notifications from my phone, could an activity tracker be what I'm after? Compatible with all mobile phone platforms, there is a reduced control interface, but for around £50, alongside tracking your activity, you can see notifications without the need to get your phone out. What is the battery life like? Will it last until you get home to charge it? What's the display like? Will you be able to see it at a glance? What if you get messaged while pointing at a pupil's work? Will they see it? Can notifications be adjusted so you are not accidentally sharing? Is it noisy? Can you silence it? Can you switch it to vibrate? And finally, some phone contracts allow you to add on extra devices. Will it be cheaper to do it that way or to buy it outright? As always, I'd love to hear your favourite teaching tech. Do you wear a smartwatch? Let us know at TTR 2022. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
I haven't bought into the smartwatch hype yet, I must admit. Mostly because I don't like wearing regular watches. Even my Fitbit kind of fell by the wayside eventually. And I was obsessed with that for about 3 weeks in a summer about 5 years ago. Maybe I'll get into them. Maybe somebody can convince me. So on Monday, the Department for Education and the Right Honourable Nick Gibb MP released a press release entitled Millions Invested in Language Lessons. Now, of course, for me, that was a delightful thing to drop into my inbox. I was so happy to see that. And as I read through it, I became increasingly happy because it talked about languages that I am very passionate about. Obviously, clearly, friends of the show will know I am passionate about all language, but it particularly picked out 3 that I teach, 3 that I speak, as well as some others. The press release essentially says, languages are a key part of a broad and balanced curriculum, and evidence suggests that learning a language has strong economic benefits, including improving international trade. The British Council's Languages for the Future also identified that Spanish, Mandarin, French, Arabic, and German are the top 5 priority languages to improve the UK's skills, security, and influence in the world. Now, I personally teach Mandarin, French, and German. My school has a very strong Spanish department, and we know that Arabic is growing. Part of our staff meetings are quite often which one of us is going to learn Arabic so that we can offer it. And it was that inclusion of German that I was particularly pleased to see, because as we know, and as I discussed with Nadia Stevens-McKesh, head of German at Wycliffe College, back at the beginning of September, we have noticed a sharp decline in learners learning German. It seems to be, for my case at least, it's a very popular language at Key Stage 3. My school introduces it in Year 8, and we have very good uptake in Years 8 and Year 9. And then it tends to drop off as we go into GCSE, because of that perception among students that language GCSEs in general are difficult. And then there's another drop at A-level. And I think my school is quite representative of all schools in that case, with German specifically. But the press release from the Department of Education goes on to say, this initiative will support the Department for Education's ambition that 90% of Year 10 pupils, so that's 90% of students who are aged 14-15, in state-funded schools study a combination of the core academic subjects as part of the EBAC by 2025, and that includes a language. It includes at least one language. So, we couldn't have timed this show any better, quite honestly. Lucy and I have been talking for a couple of weeks about timing to get her on the show. We had planned this one and talked about what we were going to discuss. And then the press release dropped. And I think we both had the same idea that this could not have been timed better if we had planned it. Lucy is the head of German at Arden Academy Trust, with a very impressive CV that I am excited to talk about this morning. And I am so happy to have you here. Lucy, guten Morgen.
Guten Morgen. Hello. It's such a pleasure to be here. This is like the best possible start to a Saturday morning, I think. Like sharing like-minded ideas and expertise with a German enthusiast and just getting to flesh out our imaginations really on the show.
Absolutely. I've been so excited for this one. I really have. You know, I love, my favorite part of the week, I think, is 8:30 on the Saturday morning when I start setting up for the show. But this week there was a definite air about the setup, because I was just like, we're going to have such a great time just talking, geeking out about language. I think it's going to be so cool.
Yep, it will be, and hopefully we'll not only galvanise everyone else into embracing their German knowledge that's existing or bettering it, but also just starting to learn German as a result. We'll see how many we can persuade.
Absolutely. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things that I like to say, particularly, I don't know about you, but for me at Parents' Evening, one of the first things parents quite often say when they sit down in front of me is, oh, I wish I tried harder at languages in school.
Yeah.
And my response is always, well, actually, you know more than you think you do. You know, you've got, there are some German words already, and, you know, they make the joke, oh, yeah, I can say ein Bier bitte. And I was just like, yeah, that's fine. That is a start.
Exactly. I think the confidence has to come from somewhere, and you're absolutely right in emphasizing that people have more than they realize. And when we're listening to one another and trying to communicate in our native language or a different language, I think our brain is always subconsciously processing those messages on a different level. And as a result, when you hear ein Bier bitte, automatically the English speaker is thinking, well, beer and beer obviously sound incredibly similar or practically the same. And if we expose them to that, to those cognates and to that language that rings familiar, they'll feel even more confident. And that's almost the approach we have to start with when teaching students a language as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I do a taster session for our Year 7s, because they pick up, like I said, they pick up their second language in Year 8. So at my school, we start with French in nursery, and they do French all the way through to Year 7, and then they can pick up Spanish or German in Year 8. And when we do a taster session in Year 7, my German one is very much focused on the cognates. You know, we very much look at, I start with Hund. Always. Hund, for those of you who don't know, is German for dog. And I ask them what they think it might mean. and we get all sorts of interesting answers. And then I write the word hound on the board, and we look at how that vowel shift happened, so that hunt in German turned into hound in English. And then we go for the more obvious ones, Garten and Maus and House, and it kind of introduces them both to the fact that cognates is something for you to hang your language onto, but also it broadens their idea of the language family. And the fact that actually, Spice being native English speakers for most of them, then German and Dutch are quite open to them. And if you learn Dutch, you can find Swedish and Norwegian very, very straightforward. And it then becomes that linear progress of, just because I'm offering you German right now doesn't mean that German is the one that you stick with, although I hope that you do. It could be a gateway into something else.
Absolutely. I'm interested before I weigh in on this.
Yeah.
How do the students respond when you start pointing out these similarities or these language families to them? Is it a surprise to them? Is it something that they hadn't noticed before? Like, what is do they respond positively, inquisitively, or a bit shocked, I suppose?
It's a really positive response. I think there is an extent to which it's a false positive response, because it's usually, German's quite easy, isn't it? And you put a smile on and you go, yes, it really, really is, thinking it will be until I teach you how to do subordinate clauses. But yeah, it generally is a positive, because of course they start with French, and while there are cognates, of course, between English and French, at the lower levels they are fewer and further between. The cognates come as your language gets more complex in French, I find. Whereas, with the German ones, they can look at it, and I think particularly for students who are not natural linguists, or who don't consider themselves to be natural linguists, it gives them a way in, I think, and they can see that it's that little bit more accessible.
Definitely. For me, the sort of one up from just pure word level, the cognates, is actually looking at the syntax of German. So of course we know that the verb changes position depending on where it lies in relation to other words in the sentence. But often when you have a sentence built like, on Monday I play football, even though the word order is slightly different, it is the same number of words.
Yeah.
And the sound resonates. So I think you have to almost trust that the students will start to recognize those patterns. And the more explicit you make that as part of your teaching, the more confident they feel that actually they're going to be able to go beyond word level pretty quickly. In talking to some of my students ahead of this broadcast, because I wanted their voices to really come through on this one, they said that one of the things that they noticed amongst their peers that dissuaded them from continuing on with language was that they found it quite overwhelming. Even though we assume that students have interacted with language, perhaps just with French or a different one, or perhaps even a native language they speak at home, when they come in and suddenly they start learning German, fresh off, they may never have had any interaction with it. They have no prior relationship with it. And too many are put off straight away, because it's the assumption that, that there's such a thing as grammar, that there's such a thing as reading skills of the language where you navigate and find all this different language that speaks to you. But it is still that new level of a new sound, different combination of words, different patterns emerging, and actually the cognitive load is too much for them. They find that they're being assumed to be more sophisticated linguists than they are, but actually with every language we have to ease in with a particular approach, get their confidence up quickly, their motivation up quickly, and then that's when we can start, letting them be a bit more independent or finding things out for themselves.
Absolutely. I'm finding, actually, before I tell this story, I am going to preface it with my bias. I am professionally invested in the EPI approach because I am writing the Japanese textbooks for the approach. So I do have a bias here, but I'm using the Gianfranco Conti's EPI approach with my Year 8 beginner's German class this year. And I'm finding that actually the cognitive load reduction that Conti talks about is very visible to me by using this approach, because it's very much a chunking approach. So they have a traditional sentence builder. So your first column is Hallo, guten Tag. Then you've got Ich heiße. Then we've got a bunch of German names. Then we've got und, ich bin, numbers, Jahre alt. And just by having the sentence builder in front of them, and it's very plain. It's designed to be plain to reduce that cognitive load, and just beginning to pick out the words, choral repetition. Let's play some games. Instead of just having a PowerPoint full of vocabulary, they are beginning to communicate right from the offset. And for me, it's that communication that, particularly at key stages 2 and 3, is so important. But it also gives them success right from the beginning, because right from lesson number 1, they are creating whole sentences that that can be understood, instead of just having these random word lists that they can parrot.
The emergence of particular methodologies like EPI, like the traction that it's gaining, makes me really pleased, because it's diversifying teachers' toolkit. I saw a fellow about languages teacher on Twitter just this morning tweet something which I think is very powerful, which is the range of approaches that we have available to us as languages teachers to diversify language teaching, really improve the quality of what's happening in classrooms. We need to be accessing that wider toolkit, and we're never going to apply one single methodology to all groups of students. So the EPI approach, I think, is really successful for bringing students' confidence up, as you say, right from the offset. I think the cultural approach, whereby if teachers feel confident enough to, where they impart their experience of languages and then use that to plan lessons, so they make them really authentic and sort of immersive, then that can up student motivation. If you've got particularly studious pupils in front of you, maybe they'll enjoy the explicit grammar approach. Who knows? Maybe they'll be able to apply that rule for themselves.
Yeah, we did, so.
Yeah, exactly. So we know we can't turn our backs on languages teaching methodologies that have existed for, multiple decades across several different curricula. But I think we do recognize there is research out there that shows us what is going to up student motivation quickly, given our limited curriculum time and given the pressure on us to be really accountable for the number of students who pick up a language. Unfortunately, teachers carry too much of that accountability. It does need to be more of a national message, but we are obviously in the prime position to push forward approaches that we know work, because we actively see that engagement from students, regardless of our context, regardless of our methodology.
Absolutely. And for me, it's that engagement that is key. And I think not just for language teachers, because I know that we've got a lot of different people listening in today, but I think across all subjects, particularly in the UK, because we are so exam focused, we can quite often lose that joy. I stand up at the front of my classroom sometimes and I forget the fact that I teach language because I love language and I think it's so important. But I don't always feel like I transmit that properly to my students because I'm too focused on making sure they understand what they need for their terminal exam.
I absolutely sympathise. Yeah, absolutely sympathise and empathise. And I would say, like you echoed, that most teachers listening in, or anyone who's been into a school, will understand that the culture is very exams driven. My approach, I was very lucky that my training year shaped me as such. I think my approach has always been the exam question and the ability to navigate said exam question, regardless of whether the language rings true to you or not. We know that exam questions, unfortunately, for languages are loaded with content that students may have never come across because it's grossly unfair. However, their ability to navigate unknown language is actually a real life skill. You're not going to pick up everything that you hear. You're not going to understand everything that you see in the written word. But how you go about navigating that unfamiliar language takes a lot of resilience, a lot of persistence, and things like problem solving, collaboration, and teamwork really help on that score. So I'm thinking to myself, when I'm building a lesson, yes, at the end, I do want to see if there's a tangible way that they can apply those skills to an exam question. But how do I know that they are going to follow me to that endpoint? And for me, that's always been about placing the language in an authentic context, using things like sentence builders or support sheets, or just real target language-driven lessons to help them feel like they can communicate and navigate that world, and then extract that skill and apply it to a much more sort of dry but equally important context of an exam question. How you go about doing that, it will be different to every teacher.
Of course. And, I completely agree, especially with the unknown language. It's always fascinating that it's no secret at my school that I have 9 languages, and the kids find that really impressive.
Wow.
Well, I always drill it as, actually, as long as if you can have 3, if you can have a Romance language, a Germanic language, and an Asian language, then actually you can get into any others. The rest of it it kind of falls into place. Some of them believe me, and some of them don't. But when we talk about it, and when we talk about the idea of fluency, they always say to me, "Well, do you know all of the words in all of your languages?" And I turn around and say, "No, I don't know all of the words in English. I don't drive, so I don't know car parts. I can't tell you what any part of an engine is, because I've never had to." And so, if I can't do all of that in my native language, it's no surprise that I can't do all of that in my foreign language. And that doesn't mean that I'm not fluent in them. It just means that I've got gaps in my vocabulary. Birds, mostly.
Or maybe that's a subject specialism, a sort of area of knowledge we all ought to pick up then.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's really pertinent what you say there, because really what we're doing with language is making every effort to communicate, that sort of essence of ourselves and our personality with whomever we're speaking. And that could be with all the vocabulary at our disposal, sort of that automatized process of recalling that language at the drop of a hat and being able to then use it to communicate, or whether our gaps, then searching for that closest synonym or the closest way of being able to rephrase that expression. And for me, I find it very important to model that thought process to my students, either when we're doing explicit modeling of a written task, or if it's me actually pausing and searching for that correct word in German before actually giving it to them, so they can see that I'm taking my time, that not all the language is at my fingertips all the time, especially within a 5-period day where, let's be honest, when we teach French Key Stage 3 and go straight to a German A-level lesson, may not be the easiest process in the world. So they have to see that I'm still, as a fluent speaker, I do struggle, but it's a struggle that I'm happy to take in order to make myself, heard and understood.
Yes, and I agree with you. I think that's so important for our students to see that being modelled. I remember very early in my career, I was always loath to do that, because I felt, as I was building my teacher persona, I felt like my subject knowledge was forever being scrutinized by the children. And so I always felt like if I couldn't call the word to mind, then I would be judged as not being a good teacher because I didn't have that immediate knowledge. But kind of as I've grown older, I've realized that actually the life lessons are just as important as the subject knowledge that we're imparting. So I keep dictionaries on my desk, and I'm very happy to look things up in the dictionary, either pretending that I need to look it up with Key Stage 3, because when they ask how do you say spider, that's not always difficult to call to mind, but you pretend so that they see it modeled. Or in A-level speaking, when there is very, very niche subject specific vocabulary that they might ask for because it doesn't come up in the course necessarily, but it's something they want to say as part of their card or their conversation. I'm very happy these days to crack open the dictionary and say, okay, let's find out. And then I've progressed now to even having a vocabulary book on my desk. So when they ask me for a new word, I will write it in my own vocabulary book and model those behaviors that I expect them to be doing as learners.
That's lovely. And I think that speaks to your experience from obviously having a multitude of students within your classroom who may be asking all these different questions. It's so interesting how year on year you'll get students who notice certain things but then ignore other aspects, and then the next year others you're teaching the same lesson maybe slightly differently, but then it'll be a 180-degree reversal. They'll notice the things that the previous cohort didn't.
Yeah.
And I love that about language. I think language should be always this mysterious puzzle that you're trying to reconfigure, and actually the puzzle pieces don't always have the same image on them. You can reconfigure the image and make different pieces fit together. So showing that you're actively searching for that synonym that is most appropriate for that context, particularly for A-level. You say it's very niche vocabulary, but actually it's the wider world of vocabulary that we have the pleasure of accessing by virtue of teaching students who are inquisitive. How can we push for that inquisitiveness throughout, so from Key Stage 3 upwards, or even from primary school upwards? I think has to be kind of a sedimentary part of policy going forward, because we're modelling here high literacy standards. That's our job as teachers. We know we have a duty to put into the world people who can read and write and speak and do all of these things to help communicate their personalities and be able to do the job that they want and navigate the world around them. The sort of graduated approach whereby we go step by step, which starts with that vocabulary book, which starts with asking the questions, which starts with being inquisitive, those are all behaviors we've got to cement very early on.
Yeah.
In order to make a successful linguist. We can't just wait for the big end game at A-level, where students have to almost sort of like fine-tune those behaviors in order to be successful at A-level. We can really start this from, right from the outset, and that can be highly motivating as well.
Absolutely. And I think primary languages is key here. As a former head of PMFL at my last school, I spent a lot of time working with the English lead on how we could encourage linguistic curiosity from reception right through to year 6. And we worked together a lot on the books that we were reading, the phonics that we were teaching, so that we could make links between what they were doing in English in their literacy lessons and what I was doing in PMFL in French and Japanese, so that they began to ask these questions, so they began to be interested in language. Because I think, as much as I tell my students these days that they are so much luckier than we were when we were learning, because I remember being so excited when we got Sky TV, and I was flicking through the channels, and randomly RTL came on, and suddenly I could hear German, whereas I'd only ever seen it written before.
Right.
And we had to actively seek out these things, whereas students now can just stick on Netflix or YouTube or whatever it might be and access anything in pretty much any language that they would like to. But I also think that I personally had a bit of an advantage at having my curiosity piqued when I was younger, because I remember my Master System. I'm dating myself now, but I remember having my Master System games console when I was must have been like year 2 and year 3, and you would buy the games and they would come in a little cartridge and they would have a little book explaining a story that had no bearing on the game whatsoever. But in those days, the story would be written in about 6 different languages going across a double-page spread. And so it would be English and then French and then German and then Italian, then Spanish, and usually Dutch on the end. And I just remember finding that so fascinating. Before I had any concept of what a foreign language actually was, it was so interesting to me that there was another version of me somewhere else who had bought this exact same game and was learning this exact same story, but through these other words on the page. And I think in England specifically these days, it is actually harder to find that kind of foreign language in the wild. And so those are experiences that we have to manufacture almost in school.
I really like that phrase, foreign language in the wild. Yeah, I think that incidental moment that you had is harder to manufacture organically or for it to happen organically for students. It has to be very purposeful. Like, if you go to Netflix and change the subtitles on your favorite show, you will see it in a different language. But it's seeing it in the written word versus hearing it. I remember my tutor at University of Birmingham when I did my training year, Dr. Adam Cook. I think he said that the first time he actually heard French spoken was when he was about 15 years old, even though he'd been learning it for some years.
Wow.
This is when the grammar translation approach was very, very heavily advocated.
Okay.
And therefore, the written word, the written example of language, was the dominant force rather than it being target language driven, but through methods of communicative teaching or through oracy. And I just found that absolutely mind blowing. Because I mean, full disclosure, my life has been enriched by language from my birth. I was brought up English and Russian bilingually by my parents. I was born in Austria, so I heard German around me, even though I went to an English kindergarten. There was a little bit of hiatus when we went to the States for my primary education, but there was still a lot of Spanish being spoken, obviously.
Yeah.
And then I lived in Paris during my secondary school and sixth form education. So I can't remember. There's never been a time where I've not heard language in the oral form, and that's probably it should come as no surprise really that that's the foundation of how I would like languages to be taught, which is hear it as much as possible, model it for the students as much as possible, because it piques their interest. They go,
Yeah.
oh, like either by talking about that word relationship between languages, or through just being really expressive through it, and them actually seeing like elements of your personality transform as a result of you speaking that other language.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that our tutor for training always advocated was that, you know, the difference in quality between us doing the same lesson but predominantly in English versus infusing parts of it with target language. He said, I actually saw you whilst I was observing you come alive. And it just does, you know, you make that a very memorable event for that student, maybe in a very subconscious, slightly intangible way, but we are guaranteed to make it continuously memorable if that is a core part of our language lesson culture.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and it's about that coming alive that I think is so important. The head of my school is a linguist. He taught French and Spanish, and when he comes in to talk to our year nines just before options time, about, because languages at my school are compulsory, so he comes in to explain to them why. And, you know, he talks about being a different person when he speaks Spanish. There is a Spanish Mr. So-and-so and an English Mr. So-and-so. And I think that's absolutely true, because for me, different languages unlock different parts of your brain and your personality, like you say. And there are some things that are quite difficult to express in one language and much, much easier to express in another. And I think the more that we can show our students that, the more parts of their own personality they can unlock, which is so important at the foundational time that we teach them when they are discovering who they are going to be as adults.
I think there's two things there that I want to talk about. I think the first is that untranslatable language, not necessarily the word itself, but just the essence of the language. You know, I think the personality that comes with a language. I was talking with my father recently. He is Russian, but he learnt German when we moved to Vienna. So he took languages lessons and then began to work with German-speaking professionals in the arts.
Amazing.
And when he talked about the use of, well, German plays, so German playwrights from Germany, or material that is from, you know, native German speakers from Germany, he said there's a certain tone in the way that it's written in terms of the structure of the language, the way that it sounds when sung in a Wagner operatic work, for example, versus then the sort of sing-song quality of the Austrians, and just the play on words that they have, which is just more evident and kind of more, it signals on a greater level the Austrian personality. It's not to say that Germans aren't humorous, because we know that they are.
Yes.
It's in the quality of the way the language is used by those native speakers. And the more that you progress through your language learning journey, the more you begin to really notice those differences, and the more that you ought to account for them when using that language more authentically. As to you talking about your head teacher being a linguist, I mean, I think the opportunity for SLT to spread this message is really fundamental. They are intrinsic to the school culture. They model the behaviors and the rules and the sort of expectations that we have on a whole school level. And I think for SLT to come in and speak to your year nines, it's really powerful, because they see that actually, even though they don't actively hear their head teacher speaking a different language all of the time, that's part of their skill set, and that's most likely what makes him or her or them quite a strong communicator.
Yeah,
and so how do we as languages teachers collaborate with SLT, or, you know, those who have the ability to spread that message, in order to make it very, again, like that foundational part of our school life?
Yeah,
I think that's something to be explored.
Absolutely, and I think it must be difficult for SLT. I'm not SLT. I've got no aspiration to be, so I can't speak for them. But I feel like it must be a difficult one for them, because they can't be seen to be promoting some subjects over others. So I understand why they would want that neutrality. But at the same time, because they do have the influence, if it is their subject, if it is their skill set, and even if it's not, and they wish it had been, there's nothing. I think there would be nothing wrong with them coming into classes and trying it out. I was always very pleased when I ran a beginners Mandarin club a few years ago. Our head of maths came, which I thought was wonderful because initially I was a bit hesitant. I wondered if it would be awkward for the students to be there learning alongside one of their teachers. But actually, they really liked it because they saw that language was important to somebody that they didn't necessarily see as a linguist. It turns out that she is. She also is a fluent German speaker, but they didn't know that. And so
Brilliant.
it really, it kind of changed their perception a little bit because it was just like, oh, languages are not just for the language teachers. They're not for the people who want to study language for the sake of studying language. They're for everybody because they want to be able to do things in the language.
I think it's so important that you say that because this is, I think, the cornerstone of what could be whole school policy. I absolutely, given what schools are going through with budget constraints and quality assurances and that high accountability, that high stakes accountability in the school culture at the moment,
Yeah.
I absolutely, I empathise to the highest degree with SLT. They cannot be seen to be playing favourites with subjects. However, what we could do as a whole school level with heads of department, for example, is advocate for that cross-subject knowledge. I know that some schools, for their sixth form open evenings, what they're doing is they're promoting their subject and then they're showing those explicit links to other subjects within the A-level curriculum, saying,
Amazing.
here are the skills they're going to learn from language and how it's going to feed into history, into English, into science. Then they're making it very explicit in terms of career links as well, developing that professional portfolio for the future. We just had our sixth form open evening on Thursday, and that was, one of the key messages we were driving through because we recognized that we had potential medics in the room, potential physicists, potential historians, etc. We said it does not matter what portfolio subjects you are doing for your A level, languages will enhance all of those things. And we had students there, who are amazing ambassadors for us, who said, even though I do religious knowledge and English and French, being able to understand and speak French has allowed me to see which words are shared in Shakespeare's plays, making those linguistic connections. We had a medic in the room who said, I really wanted to have, humanities-based or a sort of linguistic-based subject because I want to go and do medicine in the future, but I know that a lot of people also want to go on and study that. So how am I going to add that string to my bow? And that comes from their common sense, but very much a message that we're driving forward. So I think definitely in the future, we need to be collaborating with heads of departments saying, let's make one another visible in our departments rather than just staying all in our corridors for the whole day. I mean, we're so busy, but actually we might be lessening the workload for us in the future for having to recruit students to our subject if we show that actually the portfolio subject builds them as a person, not just in terms of them getting good results for particular exam subjects and doing well, but just having the skills that are transferable and that wider understanding and appreciation of the world and their place in it.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a lot of potential medics as well. Right from year 7, lots of them decide, oh, I'm going to be a doctor. And so when I led our year 9 assembly last week on why we do languages, and I trotted out the old figure that, in London, there are approximately 300,000 French speakers. That comes from the French consulate. We're not sure how true that is, but that's what the French consulate says. And so, if you want to be a doctor in London, then of course speaking French is going to be very useful to you, because if you are a French person and you are ill and you are scared, you're going to want to talk in your native language to somebody because your native language will be comforting to you. And so if you are a doctor who can speak French, you are going to be more in demand. And so again, it does loop back to the fact that for people like us, for the language geeks, learning language is an end. It is what we want to do. We learn language because we want to learn language. But for most people, language is a means to something else. It's a means to being a doctor. It's a means to being an actor. It's a means to being a business person. And I think you're right. It's about collaborating with the other heads of department, particularly departments where the links are not always so explicit, and showing the strong students in those subjects where a language can enhance that.
I fully agree. And I think that's only going to strengthen the connectivity and the sort of the network of teachers that you have within any given school context, because although we are all sort of collaborating invisibly from afar with one another nationally, we are still going into our place of work every day, and the colleagues that we have are the people with whom we most directly affiliate and interact. I suppose the part of Nick Gibbs' press release that slightly worries me is still this focus on the economic benefit of language, as if the language skill is like this commodity that we sell, that the knowledge that we gain from language must be useful, must be purposeful. Given the difficulty economically for families all around the country, I understand that the cost of living crisis and energy crisis will be at the forefront of everyone's minds, and therefore they're thinking, well, what can my child do in terms of the GCSEs that's going to lift them out of their economic plight and drive them towards higher living standards, or give them that life that I cannot currently provide for them? That's an aspiration that I'm, admire any parent for.
Yeah.
But language, there was a time where, well, there's certainly people like us and many around the world who say learning language just diversifies your personality and helps your brain work in a different way. You become creative, you become extra collaborative, you become very empathetic. And those are always skills that are prized as being useful in the modern world, which is so fast-paced and so sort of results-driven. Even our schools are results-driven. So where's the room for the more introvert personalities who are processing language in the most amazing way, but may not be the person who are, they may not be the people who are going into those highly social situations and networking to, get that business deal? Or do you see what I mean? I think there's a preference of personality when you sell the economic message, and there's certainly a preference in the way languages ought to be taught when you send that message, because you say, learn it academically, you'll do well, and you'll get a good job.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I have found that over the past couple of years, I've been quite interested to look at the students who opt for MFL versus the students who opt for classical languages. Of course, in classical languages, there is no speaking component. And so I do quite often find that the students who are that little bit more introverted, the students who are shy, the ones who kind of hated French lessons in year 7 because they had to speak and they felt silly, they're the ones who thrive quite often in classics, because that communicative element is taken away and it is much more... they sit down and they can tackle the translation or the reading comprehension or the cultural aspects much more like a puzzle. And so I do agree with you completely that quite often we turn students off of language by saying, oh, it has to be so that you can talk to other people. It has to be so that you can broker this business deal. And we take away learn it because it's interesting. Learn it because this is a very cool culture. I regret that I don't speak Spanish, because I think I've always been interested in Mesoamerican culture. And I think, learning about the Aztecs and the Mayans and all of that is fascinating. And I think if Spanish had been sold to me as learn this language and then you can find out more about the Aztecs, the bit that you do find most interesting, then that might have hooked me in Spanish in the same way that I was hooked into French and German and Japanese.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's providing that language hook, something intrigued all of us to learning that language further. For me personally, it's interesting reflecting now. I've actually never picked up a language purely from scratch. I've been introduced to it by way of where I've lived, where the opportunities that I had. So I mean, French, I suppose, is the exception. I had a very good French teacher when I was in the States, who actually, interestingly enough, also was from a theatre background, and then she transitioned to languages teaching, much like myself. But I could see. Oh, there we go. maybe there's a lineage there.
I think there is.
So I remember her. She had a very traditional, explicit approach. However, she always got us up on our feet to do role plays and really be forced out of our comfort zone, where we're not just looking at all the language at our disposal on the textbook or on notes. It's like no, just what needs to be said. Try and communicate it in a way that you can. She was a stickler for accuracy, but only for the accuracy that was meaningful. So those verbs, essentially.
Yeah.
And I found that really powerful. For me, French didn't tie in. It didn't tie for me to my day-to-day environment, but it was the breaking free from the constrictions of those structures that made me feel safe, that
Yeah.
made me feel quite confident, and really complemented my love for the performing arts, because it's all about improvising. It's about thinking on your feet. It's responding to the individuals around you, not always saying yes to the improvisation rather than
Yeah.
rejecting it. So it will come as no shock to anyone who knows me or to you that this is a fundamental part of the way I encourage students to be brave in their languages lessons. They connect with the language because they want that opportunity to show off what they can do, and I'm encouraging them to do so. And if there are errors in there, it doesn't matter. They're making that effort to speak. They're making that effort to communicate. And if they're doing that off the cuff with little to no support, eventually, then when it comes to the more regimented, structured exercise of reading comprehension, they'll have the courage and the confidence to go through with that. That's not me actively having to encourage them every step of the way. They'll be their prime motivators, and it's that peer collaboration, that knowing that they've done it together, where they
Yes.
go, okay, well, this is actively an environment which is about helping one another. And if you learn those skills in the classroom, you will intuitively apply those to any studies that you pursue or any job that you pursue in the future as well.
Absolutely, because meaning is collaborative. Meaning is created between the people having the conversation. You and I have talked over. Well, we've emailed over the past couple of weeks to kind of figure out the structure of the show, but we didn't plan anything. We kind of knew we were going to talk about German. We were going to talk about your teaching, your history, and we made the decision not to come up with a list of questions because we wanted it to be more collaborative. We wanted it to be more spontaneous, and those skills are the ones that we do need to get our students fluent in their native language as well as their foreign language. This idea that actually it doesn't matter if you always pick the exact correct word. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake in your case, as long as you're being understood and your meaning is created and what you intend is transmitted. That actually is what's most important.
I fear that there are times where I get so bogged down by the relative accountability on me to get my students good results, and sometimes I lose sight of, as we all are when we're busy, we're very capable of losing sight of the values that really make languages teaching exciting. And I think I'm slightly in that phase at the moment where I'm not quite doing the lessons that I want to, because actually I've taken on different responsibilities this year, and I'm trying to now, I'm in that sort of figuring out stage of how do I capitalize on this moment that we have with German? How do we continue to make our curriculum accessible to all? And how do we continue to advocate for best practice in our department and beyond? But when asking my students just a couple of days ago what they most enjoyed about languages learning, is that they get to sort of assume a character which is not their own. So I don't know, if I take the example of my A-level students, we just did our unit on youth and politics for the year 13 specification.
Nice.
And I got them to create political parties. I think I stole this idea from Liam Printer, actually, Dr. Liam Printer.
Amazing.
And I got them to create political parties. So they called themselves the UG-Partei. I think it was called the Umwelt Grün Partei, and then the other one was Junge Kommunisten. Not to say they were communists. I think they advocate. That's their interest for socialism.
Yes.
But the fact is that it gave me an insight into their personalities even more than what I already know of them. And every single exercise, most exercises that we did, be it a written exercise or a spoken one or a listening, I actually asked them to assume the characters of those political parties, to experiment, to then give them that opportunity to experiment with a different scope of language. So obviously they're very entrenched in their views, and that language will be more well practiced because that's the one they're inclined to use. But the more niche verbs, or perhaps those alternative viewpoints that we do have to acknowledge in order to be evaluative and perhaps a little bit compassionate and diplomatic, they welcome that challenge, and as a result they remember how they interacted with that language differently. And they also relating themselves to the culture, the history, and the politics of Germany, acknowledging that whole political spectrum, not just the part of it which offers us that echo chamber, which I think we are slightly entrenched in at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love that. I love any kind of long-term project-based learning that can really make the language useful. One of the favorite things I've ever done, and I've repeated it a few times over the years, is with Year 9 French. Because I'm not brave enough to try anything with exam-based classes, I must say. But with Year 9
Hmm.
French, running it as a big 6-week role-playing game. So
Hmm.
it was our topic, Je me présente, all about me, and they created a character, and I came up with a scenario based in Gaulish mythology, and we just played a big role playing game for 6 weeks. And all of the little quests that they had to do in order to achieve their main goal were vocabulary or grammar based. And every time they correctly conjugated verbs, they scored points so that their character could level up, and that got them more money to spend in the shop. And it was beautiful to see them communicating naturally in French because they had a reason to do it beyond this is the worksheet, please fill it in.
Yes, and the worksheet, please fill it in, has to have a place sometimes in the pedagogy as far as
Yeah,
us being able to, giving students very easy opportunities to retrieve learning, to make them feel that they can regenerate it and reproduce it without much prompting or much support, or perhaps no support at all. But I totally agree. When we talk about, sometimes the phrase active learning or learning energy is thrown around. How do we actually evidence that in languages lessons? Yes, it is that calm classroom environment where the students are paying attention to you, responding to your questioning, being independent. But sometimes, one thing I certainly have learned for the past 3 or 4 years of teaching is there's always room for a little chaos. And
yes.
actually, the students don't mind after perhaps 4 other lessons where they're working on a much more independent, slightly more traditional classroom environment, for want of a better phrase. They then come in and go, "Oh, okay. What's the experimentation today? We're entering that classroom language laboratory. Where's our
Yeah,
teacher going to put us this time?" One of the particular quotations I got from one of my A-level students who's going into the army in the next year or so. He said, "I loved the group dynamic and peer encouragement that made GCSE German really exciting, but we're also doing that immediate problem solving and being spontaneous and thinking on the spot and interacting with the language in so many different ways. The fact is, you could formulate a language lesson in about a million,
yes,
with a million different methods, million different activities. But it's that path that you choose. Okay, we're working on this skill, and we're going to push you as far as we can. But I don't think any of our students can really predict the structure of our lessons anymore. There's a general expectation and the ground rules, but I think the surprise is the thing that entices them and hopefully wins over the majority of our students to us, whereby we're just encouraging them to be really very much themselves, but push those boundaries beyond their own expectations.
definitely, definitely. And I think that's going to be so important. That's a mindset that's going to be so important for us to protect over the next couple of years, because I am noticing another resurgence in establishing routines. Make sure that your students know exactly what's going to happen at every moment of the lesson, that every lesson is formatted in the exact same way. And I think that sometimes that does rob the joy of any kind of lesson, of any exploring, because lessons should be driven by what the students are interested in, what they come up with. And our job as teachers, particularly as language teachers, is to respond to that and to give them the language that they will need to be able to express that in German.
Well, we need to be careful not to convolute that particular strand of that argument with the need for consistency. I think consistency is all about the principles that are driving your language of teaching forward and embedding those principles systematically in your lessons, but without it necessarily having that that rote approach or it being confined to a particular structure or a particular pattern of lessons. I think that's important for early career teachers perhaps to establish, just that they know kind of what's the rhythm that they want to have in an hour-long lesson. But the
Yeah,
more you do and the more you create and the more you experiment and take those risks, you'll begin to see that the lesson forms, particularly with languages, can be very diverse.
yeah,
One of the things that I believe is hindering the progress of German is kind of harking back to what I said earlier, the fact that it's seen as an economic language
yeah,
rather than a language that is so rich in history, so rich in culture. So much of what we know about how modern civilization works is because of the way that Germany, or the German-speaking world, has changed. I'm always continuing to surprise my students with the fact that German is spoken in Namibia, and they have
Yes.
they don't connect the colonial history to German. They're very used to hearing about, as far as the UK is concerned, which is a narrative that's only really emerged in the recent years. But they don't understand how language could have traveled to a part of the world that they don't perceive as being German speaking. And as soon as you reveal it to them, they say, "Oh, it makes so much sense." And I say, "Well, how do you think language is shared? How do you think language has traveled? How do you think we have speakers that come from all over the world?" It's because of the historical events that have enabled that for a good cause, or perhaps a slightly more negative cause. And yeah, I don't know. Without that sort of expertise and that contextual knowledge, if we're not willing to impart that and find the time in our lessons to make sure that the students really understand that this has greater origins and a greater origin story than just us introducing it in the lesson and them learning it, I think we're depriving them of a richer cultural capital that they really need to be equipped with.
Absolutely. I was reflecting on something similar the other day, because I fall into the trap of, when my students ask me, "Oh, why should I pick German as a subject?" I say, "Oh, well, if you want to go into medicine, if you want to go into sciences, then you will find lots of these papers written in German. Engineering is German is the language of engineering." And I forget, that we owe books to Gutenberg. I forget that we owe fairy tales, can do Hausmärchen, to the Brothers Grimm.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this whole literary side to German and a historical side to German that I think people are quite often scared to approach. Because, of course, if you talk about German colonialism, then student thought is immediately going to go to World War II. But we owe it to Germany and to the German language to go beyond that and to acknowledge that that part of history, yes, happened, but there are other parts of German history as well, which are actually more interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Really couldn't agree more. And in fact, the thing we ought to focus on is that Germany as a nation, I mean, I have my mother to thank for this, because she was a journalist who actually covered the Cold War, and she
Wow.
covered the fall of the Berlin Wall. Her love of language, and she was a fluent German speaker by the time she was 18, so she had
Okay.
a really a fundamental appreciation for it. But I think her appreciation for Germany and its people and its history came from seeing it change right in front of her eyes, understanding the significance of a piece of construction falling, thereby changing the course of the Western Eastern relations. I mean, that just opens up a whole web of knowledge and fascination and curiosity that, as soon as I unlock that fact in a similar manner to my students, they really understand that for me this is so much more than just a language. It's literally a way of life, and the history that's unfolded as a result of something like the fall of the wall, that entailed a huge reconciliation process. We talk about the Vergangenheitsbewältigung in Germany, which is literally reconciliation of the past. That process has been modeled by Germany in an exemplary fashion, not without its difficulties. But that model should be applied to the way that we reconfigure our own history, or look at any other language history for that matter. The literature that's been inspired as a result of that divide. What does it mean to be German? Them exploring the German identity. There is a whole bank of knowledge that we are simply not capitalizing on. We are not bringing on into our curriculum. We are not accounting for as being something that could really intensify the desire from everyone to learn this amazing language. One thing that I've tried to do to hopefully buck that trend is, with my year 10s last year, we started doing a literary project where every week for 30 minutes, we would read an extract from Goethe or just, a literary authentic passage or an advertisement or something that got them to interact with the language in a totally different way. And the onus is very much on them. I go, right, look for your cognates, look for what looks similar. What do you think the context is? How are you interpreting the passage? What do you get out of it? We then get it on its feet if it's a story and try and act it out as well. And, I model the narration to show how text should be read. so that they get that modeling approach from me. It's still tying into all my pedagogical principles, but it's one of those the lesson that I remember most week on week from last year with this year group, and we've continued that project into year 11 for them and started it with year 10 as well.
I love it. I love the bravery that shows, because I've spoken to so many teachers when I've led CPD sessions who have said, "Oh, I wish that I could do things like that, but I'm so constrained by my curriculum." And I sort of say to them, "Well, your curriculum is language. If you are showing them pieces of German, then you are teaching them the German language. And if you want to, take your extract of whatever you're reading, take your advert and go through and just find whatever vocabulary is on the vocabulary list for your exam board so that you can point that out. But we can make anything fit what we have to teach." And it just requires that little bit of creativity that I think sometimes we forget we're allowed to do because we are so exam focused.
Definitely. I've become very passionate about professional development in the last couple of years, but particularly around COVID, when there was a huge amount of knowledge being shared over Twitter between language teachers, just to make language teaching still pertinent and still befitting the context of lockdown. And as a result, I started to explore every manner of authentic resources, be it videos or text. And I began to do much more with less, because I found that if the students were navigating the knowledge themselves from their homes, whatever circumstances they had within the home, it was still going to be an overwhelming process. And therefore, I didn't want to give them the traditional language lesson in the way that I would have taught it in the classroom, because they haven't got me as a resource in the room.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, how can it be much more student-led? How can it be much more student-empowering? And as a result, I began to find curriculum materials that were much more responsive to them as people and really chimed with the modern world that they had around them, which is, ever in flux, by the way, as we've
of course
well experienced the past couple of years. But I totally agree that the curriculum it does have to be governed by language which is highly contextual and cross-contextual and is repeated and retrieved for the purposes of an exam, and will inevitably become the language that they feel comfortable with in order to start communicating in the authentic world. But we're missing, as I said before, key opportunities to look back and think, well, where in our curriculum can we really take the time to actually find this fantastic authentic resource and maybe build a curriculum around it, or at least make it start with just part of our lesson sequence in the fortnight.
Absolutely.
We're also not acknowledging the wealth of research and practice that is going out there that shows how motivating those resources can be. And that research has existed for some decades now, but still isn't being acknowledged by all schools. And the reason being, I think, is because we lack the time. We lack the time to step back and really be able to reflect on the quality of what's being produced. Are we reflecting on the quality because actually they're retrieving those opinion verbs and justification on all those nuggets of knowledge they know we know they need for the exam, or are we genuinely impressed by that still? Like, are we happy with that being the output? For sure. But particularly for lower literacy and SEN students, I'm delighted if they can retrieve that of their own accord. I know that I also have a duty to prepare them for the way the language is used in the real world, should they choose to use it in any manner in their future careers or their future lives.
Yeah.
But I need the time to be able to reflect on how I embed that fundamentally in the way that I teach, not just me, but all of my colleagues and those who I continue to train in the future.
Absolutely, and it is, and I think time is the one resource that all teachers would love to have so much more of. One of the reasons that I was so excited about this morning was just because it gave me the opportunity to have an hour and a half to sit down with another German teacher and have a conversation. And the fact that this conversation is being broadcast to people, and it will exist on Spotify, on whatever the Apple one is called that we are recorded on, I forget. That's great, because it means that at some point other German teachers will be able to take the time, be it when they are cooking dinner, be it what they are waiting for the bath to fill up, whenever it might be, to listen to this conversation and to join in with us. And I think that kind of asynchronicity is something that we got very good at over COVID. You know, you mentioned how generous teachers were sharing things on Twitter, and that has stayed, I think. And it's the
Yeah.
idea that we can have these conversations, and you know, you and I can have this conversation right now at the same time, and our listeners can join in. But this conversation exists in perpetuity, and somebody can listen in a year's time, and they can tweet us, and we will still be having this conversation. We will still be happy to engage with that, because the things don't change.
No, I feel we do need to acknowledge that the conversation we're having now is the start of what I hope will be a very active and engaging implementation process, but it is
Yeah.
a fight that we are going to have to really promote and
Yes.
stick by for
Yes.
some years to come. I mean, we know that the first Centre of Excellence was already created 4 years ago to actively promote French and German and Spanish teaching, and yet there's still been a decline of uptake on the number of students.
Yeah.
I think that might be due, looking at the 9 hub schools that exist with the NSELF at the moment with the University of York. Apart from Bradford, I felt like those were predominantly, white. Unfortunately, they were white British areas. They're not really tapping into the multiculturalism of Britain. And I was also thinking, well, where is the expertise in those schools? I don't know. As a German teacher, I felt maybe I should have been more proactive in finding out who the German teachers are within those schools, what made them identified as hubs. And then I'm thinking, if the expertise isn't necessarily there, then where else in the country is it? And surely that's the starting point for then coordinating these new centres for excellence that Nick Gibbs is going to invest nearly £15 million in to up to drive the uptake for students to take up German as a language, and for German just to be offered in the curriculum. I mean, we know that German is being dropped from state school curriculum left, right, and centre.
Yeah.
It's so disparaging. So we shouldn't really be surprised at the decline in number of state school students doing German A-level, because it's like, well, they haven't had that foundation knowledge introduced to them within their catchment area. Where are they going to get that exposure? As for German teachers who are listening to this podcast now, or as an episode later on, I think we all need to see and hear each other so much more frequently. I love going to conferences and love doing workshops where I'm meeting German teachers, and as you say, like, having that empathy and sympathy for one another is really powerful. That's not something we have to search to create. That's an energy that already exists. We want to connect, and we want to think about, how do we change this culture fundamentally? So, I'm doing a bit of a call out now. Let's seize the opportunity. Let's all come together. Let's try and put together some sort of petition or manifesto that we send to our local councils or even higher up, and get the keep this momentum going. We can't wait for the next Centre of Excellence to be built. We can't wait for, yet another Tory politician or any other politician from any party to advocate for our interests. We're the ones who are in schools, who know better, who can see what's happening, diagnose the problem. We've spoken about it yet again and again, and we have to drive that forward. We need to come together. This is our moment for sure.
Absolutely. And it is about us doing the work to make this happen. I think there is a danger that we can look at the press releases, we can look at the white paper and go, oh, amazing, the government has got this under control, Germany is going to have an increase, and then rely on that. But actually, exactly as you said, it is about us as the German teachers capitalizing on that and doing the work in order to make this a success. Sorry, go ahead.
I suppose I completely understand. Again, we talk about time.
Yes.
Teachers are short on time, and by no means am I saying sacrifice the importance of what's going on in front of you. You've got your students. I know that's of our first priority, and that will remain our first priority. What I'm saying is that to help to prevent the very probable danger of teachers leaving the profession because they don't feel satisfied with what they're being tasked to do, therefore it's up to us to change the system so it makes it more motivating for us. We talk about motivating students. Where's the empowerment for the teachers?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I much as I love going and recruiting for my subject, I sort of wish I didn't have to do it on top of everything else that I feel obliged to do, because really the momentum, given the narrative around how languages learning is so important and how we ought to invest in it properly, we've been saying that for years, and it hasn't really changed the system much fundamentally. What absolutely has remained is the determination of those working within schools or working with the likes of the Goethe Institute or other bodies that are trying to engage German teachers to say, look, we're here, we matter, we still understand the importance of this, and the vitality has not changed, but maybe we're missing the opportunity to really listen and speak to one another so that it becomes that cohesive, holistic approach that is driven by teachers, for teachers and students. That for me is a much more memorable message.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, my school, we are hoping to be part of the hub. I looked at the application form yesterday, and kind of as I went through it, I did think this is going to put a lot of work onto my head of German, because German is so central. But then I thought, well, actually, viele Hände machen bald ein Ende. And if all if all of us as German teachers can work together, it actually doesn't need to be the onus of the head of German in the hub schools. It's the whole of the German department in those schools, and the whole of the German departments who are learning from them, who are feeding into them, to work together, to come together, to organize our own conferences, all of that sort of thing, so that we can spread the workload and all benefit from what the others are doing.
Absolutely. We have, that's exactly the moment we need to create. I know that, a colleague of mine, Liz Black, who is part of the Association for Language Learning, did a German Teachers' Day back in, when was it? June? Yeah, in June, where that was for German teachers only, a very nice little, gold dust group of people coming together and sharing ideas. But no doubt there are conversations there of how do we make resource sharing more purposeful, and how do we make sure that the connection between us remains constant, that we're not just waiting for the opportunities to come together through a conference or through a workshop or these specially designed events, that actually the communication is continuous, because I certainly feel the weight of the fight on my shoulders. And I am currently, apart from a colleague of mine who helps me teach Year 9 German, I'm the only German teacher in the department.
Okay.
So really I'm thinking, well, I need to leave a bit of a legacy for my school and for future generations of students. I need to make sure the curriculum is secure, and I also need to make sure that uptake and teacher recruitment is secure. How am I going to ensure that my expertise is reaching all across the country who might be currently training or indeed looking to relocate, so that actually they know that within the West Midlands region there is an amazing school who still have German as part of their state school curriculum, who are vying to keep it part of the subject offer that they provide. So you doing your hub application, we need to be able to learn from that. We could be a centre of excellence ourselves as well in the future if this thing gains traction. Why do double the amount of work when thinking this is a lone fight, when really this is a collaborative fight? We talk about language being the subject which promotes communication. Let's model that effort to our students by showing that we are not above learning from one another, and actually making this more of a collective effort to keep our language alive.
Definitely. And it is so easy these days. I mean, before the show, when we were emailing, we joked about the ongoing demise of Twitter. But while Twitter still exists, and it's so easy to be in contact with each other as German teachers, there's nothing to stop us coming together and figuring out, where are their commonalities, who is doing which exam board, so that they can get together on specific resources. Where can we share Key Stage 3 resources, because Key Stage 3 curricula are much for muchness. How can we take what might be small classes of 2, 3, 4, 5 students at A level and connect them so that they've got other people to practice with?
Honestly, I think about the opportunities I've had to connect my A level students to their contemporaries, and I've never capitalized on that. But you're absolutely right. That's a very obvious kind of like glaring thing, that a thing staring us in the face of. And being able to drive this thing forward in a much more kind of, again, like collective and productive way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I would love to see is, and this was inspired by a conversation I was having at school earlier this week. A friend in the Spanish department is looking at connecting her GCSE Spanish class with a school, I think in South America, so that they can chat and things like that. And I thought that's lovely, but we could do that as teachers. Why are 4 of us all teaching Goodbye Lenin when one of us might be a Goodbye Lenin expert and could produce a video lesson that goes around to everybody.
Yeah.
And then
I'm happy to do that, by the way, because I mean, let's all admit we love a Goodbye Lenin lesson.
Oh,
It's a
absolutely.
fantastic film. But no, like some of us might be better versed in the language of film and theatre, and therefore our ability to more comfortably teach the play, literature, and film at A level. That's expertise we ought to be sharing, and someone might be much better at interpreting novels, and therefore, I ought to learn from them.
Yeah.
There's many connections to be made, but you're right. There has to be this sort of coordinated approach before we kind of run away with all these fantastical ideas and not make them actually pragmatic to and sort of like applicable to our work schedules and the sort of realistic boundaries of our ambition here.
Yeah.
I think we do need to take that into consideration.
We do, absolutely. And I think, quite often that balance can be very difficult to get. I'm very guilty of it. A colleague said yesterday, when I was kind of having a moan about workload, she said, "Yeah, but Darren, you say yes to everything." And I kind of went, "Oh yeah, actually I do." So we do have to take our own workloads into consideration. But kind of the flip side of that is, as we were saying earlier, we can't wait for somebody else to do it. At some point people do have to take the lead, and if that means that you and I carry on our email thread in about 10 minutes time when the show's over, and we end up organizing something for January for a load of German teachers to get together, then that's what we'll do.
Sounds great. Let's do it.
I think we should. And then when if we create our own little hub, then the teachers who are interested can start to be delegated different things to do, and eventually it grows. So what can happen as a few weeks of intense work for 2 or 3 people, I think if it's done pragmatically, like you say, within the boundaries of what is and isn't appropriate, given school contexts and given timings and everything, I think very quickly it could become something really exciting.
Definitely. I was thinking about, what was the thing I wanted to get across most in our discussion, and I understand that what we're talking about are these like really big ideas that are going to require big long-term vision and change, something that's very imaginative, policy driven. It's giving teachers the time to advocate for it, and it's also making it part of that national discussion, constantly, and the two of them married together. In the short term, though, I mean, I already know so much incredible work is going on in schools in terms of that urgent discussion, the methodologies being shared, research-informed practice coming into schools, student ambassador programs, cultural weeks and events run by language departments for the whole school. That's awesome. We sort of need to take that and say, right, teachers in the short term, what is it that you can do now so that we keep the conversation going, keep this momentum going. I think if teachers have the ability to put themselves into their teaching, something about their life or biography into their lessons, again, as I said, taking that time to be brave enough to step away from the exam content and the curriculum content and say, right, here's a video that I remember watching when I was 8, 9. We're going to watch it, see what language we can extract from it. Brilliant. And then that will up the kids' drive to engage with the lesson. I think coordinating with heads of department, like we said, to make sure that MFL teachers are seen around the school and that languages becomes part of a cross-subject portfolio rather than the singular subject that stands on its own 2 feet. I think that's very urgent. Like I said, that manifesto, banding together, finding the principles that we think are crucial for German and for other languages to help them grow. Maybe writing to our MP could happen as well.
Yeah.
And finally, we're forgetting that the really key component part of this is maybe the students.
Yes.
We talk about the ambassador program that was already running in schools, but is there an opportunity to show them how language is linked to particular job opportunities, and maybe therefore give them a chance to run part of the lesson, because then they can advocate for their own interests? Is there going to be time set aside where we have these off-piece conversations with students where we listen to how they're interpreting the world around them, and is that therefore going to act as fodder for our lessons and our medium-term planning? We have the key opportunity and the fundamental need to drive oracy and literacy standards upwards. The students are the ones who need to learn from us that it's okay to sometimes go in these risky directions to give them the stage and offer them that platform to make themselves heard. I think if we just create that culture of empowerment between students and teachers, whilst we're then waiting for the national portfolio to be driven through these centres of excellence and investment, when those are ready, everyone's ready to assume that role and, change the tide, I think.
Absolutely. That is the perfect message to end our show on today. Thank you so much for coming on. It has been everything I hoped it would be and more.
Definitely. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Und wir sollen eigentlich immer auf Deutsch reden, ne?
Genau, ja.
Hoffentlich noch. But and thank you again to also the listeners who've tuned in, or if you listen to this episode. And we really do want to hear from you. So please do reach out to us on Twitter, because we want to galvanize everyone and seize on the opportunity to really make change.
Absolutely. Today has been very, very German focused, which I have loved. Lucy, I do hope that I can have you back on the show maybe in a few weeks' time, because of course you shared all of your experiences with me, and scrolling through your LinkedIn, it just goes on and on and on. And I would love to talk a little bit about your history, and about all the different things that you've done, because you have such an interesting background that kind of feeds into teaching. So I would love to have you back on to talk about that.
More than delighted to. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Where on social media can we find you?
So I can be found on Twitter, if it still exists as a platform, at @LJasmine, and you are more than welcome to send me messages via LinkedIn as well. And I'm actually on my social media channels. I'm pretty full, and I have also got ties to the Association for Language Learning, which if you are not a part of already, I really do. I really do think that all languages teachers should be part of this amazing community, because that's where you're going to find such solace. So that can also be reached through there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been
worries
amazing. Schönes Wochenende.
Schönes Wochenende.
Tschüss. And as always, thank you to all of our listeners for joining in today. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I have. A big thank you once more to Lucy for coming on. It's been wonderful to speak to you. And you are very much an inspirational teacher. So thank you for all that you do, and all that I'm sure you are planning on doing. There is a late show this evening, so please do join in for that. I'm afraid I'm not on next weekend. I'm not around next Saturday morning, so I will not be having breakfast with you. However, I will be back the week after. I believe that is something like the 3rd of December, where we will be talking Christmas traditions, including Krampus, to keep it on a German theme. So I look forward to that. Have a good 2 weeks, everybody, and I will speak to you all soon. Danke sehr. Tschüss.